The following conversation is with Alan Nichol, who is the CTO of Rasa'a. Now, for those of you who have been involved in conversational AI for a long time, you will know Rasa'a. For those of you who maybe is just getting into generative AI, conversational AI, Agentic AI, you might not have heard of Rasa'a. But Rasa'a in 2016 and beyond was the leading open source NLU model and also the leading open source chatbot building framework. A lot of enterprise chatbots were built on the Rasa'a framework from 2016 onwards. Rasa'a have been a keen supporter of the Unparsed conference and VUX World over the years, and we appreciate them for that. I'm definitely a fan of Rasa'a. This conversation with Alan is all about what's changed since we last did something like this. Alan was on the podcast in March 2022. We did a webinar together in October 2022. And a month after that, the world changed. ChatGPT was launched and everyone got the craze for LLMs, and all of a sudden Agentic AI is the thing that everyone's concerned about. I talked to Alan today about Agentic AI, what it really is, whether or not that's actually what businesses need, whether they need non-deterministic workflows and LLMs guiding things, and the way that Alan explains how to select technologies for business logic and for process automation is very much enlightening. He also talks about the concept of dialogue management, which if you've been a listener of the VUX World podcast over the years, you'll know the importance of dialogue management in conversational user interfaces. I talk about the full stop problem with RAG systems all the time, which is that they don't understand the nature of conversation, which means they cannot progress conversations in the direction that the user needs them to go. They end every response with a full stop. We talk about that. We talk about the nature and the complexities of dialogue management, and we talk about how Rasa'a has created the CALM program or the CALM framework that essentially abstracts all of the messiness of dialogue management so that the people who are designing and building conversational applications don't need to worry about things like grounding, error handling, disambiguation, and all of the stuff that used to take all of your time before. We talk about the death of intents and whether intents actually are dead. The CALM framework doesn't actually use intents whatsoever. It's certainly not in the traditional sense of machine learning classification. It's got a totally different approach. And we talk actually about the differences between intent and intention. We talk about the difference between classifying and categorizing. We talk about the importance of having solid workflows, business workflows, and how that is actually different to the conversational process or conversation dialogue paths that exist. And most platforms today conflate the two, which is why it gets very messy. And so Alan shares with me how Rasa'a essentially separate those two things to allow you to focus on the business process and abstracting most of the messiness of dialogue management. It is a very deep conversation. If you're experienced in building chatbots, it'll be one that is worth listening back to a number of times. If you're not experienced in building chatbots or voice bots, it will give you a real insight into what it used to be like and the affordances that large language models have given us now in order to be able to make really natural, really engaging conversations that work for users and that add real value to the business. Without further ado, this is Alan Nichol from Rasa'a. Hello, Alan.
Hello, Kane. Thanks for having me on.
That's all right. How are you?
Very well. Yeah, good start to the year. How about you?
Good. Yes, good. Thank you. Good. Thank you. We were just saying that we haven't seen each other for half a year since the last Unparsed. Doesn't feel that long ago, but it was half a year ago. There you go.
Yeah, I mean, a lot's happened since then, so plenty to catch up on.
Yeah, and also I was just looking that. Do you know when the last time you were on the VUX World podcast was?
2021.
It was March 2022.
Okay.
And
all
then
right.
we did a webinar together in October
Cool.
2022. And then the world changed.
Right. A month later. Yeah.
So
yeah.
a lot's changed in 6 months, but a lot's changed since the last time that we were doing that webinar, because a month after, obviously, ChatGPT was launched. There's been a lot of changes to the Rasa'a platform since then. I think a lot of advancements have happened in terms of your thinking and the way that you're approaching this kind of stuff. So I'm always keen to figure out where your head's at and how you're seeing things unfold, what the general trends in the market are, and also what the realities are today. Because I think that you probably agree that there is a lot of talk about agentic AI. It's the future. It's going to solve all of our problems. It's the magic bullet. I've done a lot of research into that recently for the Substack article I wrote, which was defining it based on research going back to 1995 and before. And the realities of agentic AI are not what most of the vendors would have you believe, but you seem to at least have your head screwed on about this. So let's start maybe with what has changed for Rasa'a since we did that webinar in October 2022. ChatGPT was released in November 2022. Obviously, you were aware of large language models before that, but the general mass adoption and notoriety, if you like, happened then. So what's changed in the last 2 years?
Yeah, it's so much. I sometimes equate it to like a nuclear bomb going off on our industry, right? And I mean, I think some of the things you were talking about, and we'll get into all this as well, but you and I have been part of this community, the sort of conversational AI practitioner community for a number of years. But the biggest thing that's changed since ChatGPT is that there's 100x more people thinking about and working on and doing stuff with conversational AI. And kind of to your point about things that happened in the past and like ideas that existed since the 80s and all that kind of stuff, I think there's a tremendous amount of amnesia or just people coming into the space and not knowing anything about what happened before, right? So it's an interesting bifurcation where now the market is so much bigger and yet it's so much more fragmented.
Yeah. And they don't even call it conversational AI. I don't know if you've noticed that.
No, that's true. Yeah. Well, I mean, and I commend you I read your article from the other day. I commend you for taking a stab at defining what an agent is. I declared bankruptcy on that a while ago and just said, whatever, it just means chatbot. Who cares?
Yeah, I know. Well, that's part of the problem.
No hill I want to die on, but I appreciate you, trying to bring some order to the chaos.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing is that the thing that's pissed me off a little bit is that I see often, and maybe it's those people maybe who've come into the kind of scene since the launch of ChatGPT, but at the same time, there's a lot of vendors that are extremely guilty of this, which is that the concept of agentic AI is now very current and very cool and very kind of like, the thing, because that's what OpenAI are talking about and what Google are talking about. But everything that I see in here, there was a post literally this morning on LinkedIn with somebody talking about the difference between workflows and agentic AI. And the diagram that they posted was of agentic AI was a workflow. It was an if this, then that big process map. And it's kind of like there's just so much noise and rubbish. So I thought, well, surely it's not new. So if you actually have a look, it goes all the way back to distributed artificial intelligence from the 70s. There's loads of definitions that have been had a stab at in the 90s. And what all of the vendors are doing, and now I'm talking about Google and Microsoft, Amazon's actually got its head screwed on. OpenAI is the same. But Anthropic, LangChain, all of these companies, they're all adamant that there is a scale of agenticness and that on the one side of agenticness, it's rule-based workflow logic. But the reality is that research in this space is very clear, really, that if this, then that workflow logic isn't agentic, it's a program. And so it was very interesting to find that, because now there's almost a sort of, I think it's fair, and I don't think the definition should have changed. It's for me, I think that vendors are changing what the definition is to put like old wine in new bottles. Would you agree or not?
I mean, I suppose I take the position that if a conversation is successful and helps somebody gets done what they need to do, who cares? Like, who cares what's that behind it? I mean, I'm maybe more of a pragmatist there, but I generally, I mean, I agree. And as I say, I'm impressed you kind of took the time to write it out and collate all these definitions and try and come up with some order. But it's 100% the case that the pragmatics of the word just mean, well, whatever we were doing before, but we've slapped the word agentic on it, and that's what it is now, right? But I think but one of the big things that has changed that I'm very excited about is we were kind of this weird, Rasa'a was this sort of weird platform and this weird group of people who were being very vocal that like things needed to change and that we needed new ideas, and that the way people were building chatbots wasn't fit for purpose, and that we kind of, needed different paradigms and all these kinds of things. And there was a community that was game for that, but I think there was a lot of resistance to it. And what I'm personally excited about now is that everybody's so much more open to new ideas, right? And
Mm.
everybody's like, oh yeah, actually we should do things differently. And actually, yeah, there's like life beyond, an intent classifier and a decision tree, right? So that's something I'm, personally excited about.
Yeah. Well, you were talking about the so-called death of intents well before 2022, and I think at the time maybe it didn't receive the attention perhaps that it should have, because perhaps people didn't necessarily understand exactly what the alternative looks like, because large language models weren't as prevalent as they are today. And so have you found that prophecy of the death of the intent, so to speak, has come to pass, and are people a bit more accepting of that now, given that, RAG doesn't use intents, for example, in the traditional sense that we know them as,
Yeah.
etc.? Like, how do you feel about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear everybody talks to ChatGPT and realizes that there isn't like a little classification going on in the background, going, oh, this person is asked for an email request. Let me give them an email template, right? There's obviously something a lot richer going on in terms of understanding what your request is and responding to you. So I think that, seeing is believing. But I mean, I think it's also totally valid that it's one thing to sort of identify the root cause of the issue. And I felt that intents were the original sin of conversational AI very early on. But the alternative to not using intents have become so much more practical and so much more compelling, right? If I think about 2020, we released our first sort of truly intentless dialogue models, but like you really really had to be a deep set of experts to use them, and collect a lot of training data and tune your models carefully and all this kind of stuff, right? So the usability of doing something intentless has obviously completely dramatically changed.
Mm. How so? Let's, for example, the notion of intentless.
Mhm.
How does that reconcile with the concept of deterministic workflows? Because
Yeah.
you posted something really good on LinkedIn that I shared fairly recently, which was, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was something to the effect of, if the massive problem of RAG is hallucinations, then
Mhm.
and if that's the inherent problem of large language models, then putting the same technology into an agentic process that's going to deliver against business workflow logic and high stakes processes, that seems like a recipe for disaster if we can't properly retrieve and summarize
Right.
information. So
Yeah.
on the one hand, there seems as though part of your thought process is that using large language models to manage workflow logic isn't necessarily the right thing. But at the same time, there is the concept of having no intents. So how does
Yeah.
a no intent landscape marry together with a deterministic process?
Yeah. It's a really good question. I'll maybe answer it philosophically and then answer it practically. I mean,
Hmm.
philosophically, you've got your world as an organization, and you've got the end user's world, right? And the end user comes in and says something about their life, something that has happened to them, right? Say, I lost my wallet. Cool, good story, right? But that, sometimes we talk about that as disambiguation, but I think that's the wrong approach. What the person said is perfectly clear. You're not disambiguating. It's your job to figure out which of the things that you can do for them is the right thing to do, right? And so the awkwardness of intents always used to be that we had to try and map these categories of like things that people are saying. We would tend to like define intents according to like what we can do for people, and it wouldn't map to like what people's real problems were and how they would talk about their problems. And then you always had this awkward dance of trying to match the two, and this sort of house of cards of like, well, if the person says this and maybe they say that, and then maybe they add some more information, and then we know what they really want. So that sort of rigid approach of the task of understanding a user is just to categorize things. That's the original sin, right? Is just saying there's 200-300 things that people can say, and they're either saying hello, or they're asking for a new card, or they're asking for a refund or whatever. And
Mm.
just my job is just to categorize that. So that's a very like impoverished and oversimplified model of understanding what a user wants, what their intention is, as it were. Um, but like once you've identified what it is they really want, there's so many advantages to having that process structured, right? You've got some business logic. Okay, the person needs their card replaced. They've got a few cards with you. So first you got to figure out which one it is. And then, maybe you already sent one in the last few days. You got to check some API, see if there's one pending that's already been sent out. They just haven't received yet. Maybe you got to check for some fraud conditions or whatever it might be, right? There's some sort of logic to that process. That's something that you know. It's something that you know up front. You don't need like an LLM to guess that for you. And you can build systems that are much easier to build, to debug, to understand, that are much more reliable because they don't just make things up, much more controllable and much better to design. So from a conversation design perspective, you've got that level of control and you can compose together pieces of reliability and all those kinds of things. So the trick is really just to marry the ability of large language models to understand, manipulate natural language, to ask clarifying questions, to get to the root of what the person wants, to like nicely formulate answers and paraphrase things and all those kinds of things. So use the LLMs for the ability to have a natural conversation, but just augmenting the LLM with a system that sort of reliably executes your business logic. This is kind of to the point that I made at the beginning. Kind of, if the conversation is successful, who cares, right? There's no brownie points for the conversation going better just because your LLM guessed the steps, right? Like the end user doesn't care, and it just means that it was probably very slow and error prone, right? So you're much better off sort of writing those things down. So to answer your question about sort of what's changed in Rasa in the last couple of years, I mean, it's really everything, right? We really said, look, we have been at this game for quite some time. We know the kinds of conversations that people want to build. We have a new generation of models that can do something qualitatively different, right? I mean, we had, BERT and GPT-2 and things like that support in our NLU models in the past, but these new models can do something different. We know the kind of needs of an enterprise. So we just started from a huge collection of, types of conversations that we know people need to be able to build, right? Like clarifications and, disambiguation, for lack of a better phrase. People changing their minds about things, hesitating, correcting, switching from one task to another, like all these kinds of things that were always quite tricky to implement in an LU-based world. And we worked with a bunch of conversation designers and said, look, these are the things that people care about, and just collected that as a set of cases. And we said, okay, right, forget everything we know, forget intent, forget anything else you know. How do we build a system from the ground up that can handle these things, right? And I remember sort of showing the list of things we wanted to do to some conversation designers, some of whom are sort of well known in your community, in the sort of early days of the project, and they were like, "Wow, look, if I had a conversational AI platform that could do half of these things, I would be very, very pleased," right? It was a bit daunting at the time, but piece by piece, we chipped away at it, and then we built this system, which we then called CALM, conversational AI with language models, and I mean, it does those things, right? So the benefit you get from that system is that you just provide that minimal business logic, right? Okay, I have this task, which is replacing this person's card. I've got to call this API and see how many cards they have, and then figure out which one it is. So I need that information from them. Which one is it? I don't know. Maybe I need their address. Like, there's a couple little bits of information that I need. But you don't have to map out all the possible conversations. So the nice thing about the CALM system is you just provide that business logic, and the conversation handling part, the conversation repair part, the disambiguation, the switching from one task to another, all that just works automatically. Right? So you don't have to worry about all that stuff. And that was kind of getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. We built this no-code UI called Rasa'a Studio, and you really just use it to build that core business logic and sort of refine the bits that you care about. And something that I always hated about so many of these no-code platforms was that you have this one UI that was representing two different things. One is, here's the core business logic of this process. And the other is, here's all the possible paths. Like, what if the user says this, and what if the user says that, and then go here, and then go back to start and collect $200 or whatever it was. and it would always just look like a plate of spaghetti. And we don't have that, right? We just have this like very simple linear thing, and the having a conversation part and the nuance and dealing with corrections and switching topics and tasks and all of that stuff, just taken care of for you.
That's very interesting. I mean, we used to have to kind of like color code diagrams that says, at this point, this bit is the business logic bit, this is where it needs to end up. And after that, it goes all over the place, here, there, and everywhere. Then, but really, what we need to do is get into this bit next. So that sounds a very interesting way of what's the word? Abstracting the dialogue management part, because the other part, the other part, and I want to come back to intent in a minute, but the challenging part, and basically the job for most conversation designers has traditionally been: you start a new project. And essentially, every single platform, I don't know what Rasa'a was like back then, but every single platform, you start from scratch every single time. You've got to build your handlers for objections. You've got to build your handlers for fallbacks. You've got to do the same stuff every single time. Some platforms allow you to build patterns and stuff like that you can reuse across projects, but honestly, not a lot of them do. Sometimes you can't even share intents from different projects. So it's kind of like you have to start from scratch at building everything from the ground up. So the first 50% of effort was just to stand up the bones of a conversation so you can handle it when someone changes their mind and does. Do you know what I'm saying? So you haven't even touched the actual
100%.
conversation yet. You're messing around with all this, mess. You got to write dialogue for it all as well. So it's like endless.
Yeah, no, for sure. Right. And it's, I mean, if you look at what are supposedly sort of design tools for conversation, I mean, even if it's just the simplest version, like it's a prototyping tool. The promise is that you're working in some representation that's sort of abstract of the implementation. But then as soon as you want to get a prototype, you do have to start thinking about the implementation, right? If you want to have more than just a static diagram, but you actually want to play with it, you're kind of like, well, we do actually have to think about implementation details. So I think we're getting closer to that now, that you can really genuinely say, okay, these are actually the things that I care about. And these are the things that are important to us. And I don't have to, explicitly deal with all the edge cases. But it's funny what you say about that, because so the name Rasa'a of the company comes from tabula rasa, right? Like a blank slate. And it was kind of a joke because it was a machine learning based product. And you don't know anything until you've had some experiences. Your model doesn't know anything until it's seen some data. And that was sort of the idea behind the name. But I mean, now it couldn't be further from the truth, right? Like when you start a project with Rasa'a, it's not a tabula rasa at all. Actually, it knows a lot of things about language and about conversation, and that's maybe something else that if I can be the old man with a gripe is and complain about the new kids is so many of the things you see now of like, here's how to build a chatbot, here's how to build an agent, all of this stuff clearly built by engineers who have never ever thought about the structure of a conversation or how dialogue works or any of these sort of fundamental concepts, right? It's just like, oh, it's just a string, and then you add more stuff to the string, right? So I think we do well to sort of highlight the many contributions of everyone who's not an engineer to the field so far.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's I don't think there's an understanding. It's like when you say that the industry's got amnesia. It's not even amnesia. It's just that there's not an understanding of it. It's like my gripe is like the full stop problem, I call it, with RAG systems, is that it always ends in a full stop. Every single answer ends in a full stop. It doesn't understand what you're trying to accomplish. Doesn't understand that your utterance is an action. It's not a question, but it treats everything like a question, and so it never progresses the conversation forward because it doesn't understand what turns are. Doesn't understand what sequences
are. No, you're
so
right. You ask a RAG system, someone shows you the RAG system that they built, and then you ask it a question, and then you say, "Tell me more," and it just bonks out.
Exactly. Yeah. So a couple of things you said that was interesting there. One is about the dialogue management bit, and you said that Rasa'a essentially handles all the dialogue management. How does it do that? Because it needs to understand, if you go back to the business logic, let's say that you're a bank and you do various things. Credit cards, mortgages, loans, accounts. So the disambiguation has to have an understanding of that stuff, because you can't have a standardized disambiguation that just says, sorry, I didn't understand that. You'd need something that says something along the lines of, it sounds as though you're talking about credit cards, can you be whatever. The disambiguation needs to be contextual based on what the customer context is. So how do you manage to kind of abstract the dialogue management around things that are not going well in conversations, as most stuff doesn't, in a way that is fit for the business type and the use cases and all of that kind of stuff?
So the way I think about an AI assistant is its job is to translate between these two worlds, like the end user's world. I'm a human being. I just got out of a cab. I lost my wallet. And then you're talking to a bank, and the bank's like, we've got a cards department, and we've got a credit cards department, and we've got a mortgages department, and they've got different APIs, whatever, right? That's their world. And the job of an AI assistant is to translate between those. And the way that we used to do that is through this sort of intermediate thing, which was like intents and slots, right? So that was the sort of mutual language we would use to try and map between the two. What we do instead now is, because what qualitatively these new models they can do is they can understand the full conversation in context, and not just like looking at one message, but looking at the whole history of the dialogue and looking at a bunch of context about your business logic, where you are in the conversation, what other options are available, what kinds of things might be relevant, and then saying, here's what the user's saying, and here's what that means in the context of the business logic, in the context of this conversation. So I'll give you a concrete example. It's one of my favorites. Airline asks the user, are you traveling in economy class? And the user responds and they say, sadly. Right? Like you and I, we read that, it's perfectly clear, right? The pragmatics of it, perfectly clear. Yes, of course, the person's traveling in economy class. In the old NLU-based world, you would have this sole word, sadly. And God knows what you're going to do with it, right? Like it's clearly not a good like training example for a yes intent, right? It doesn't make any sense. It's not an entity. Like what do you do with that thing? So the way that it works in CALM and the new versions of Rasa'a is that just immediately gets translated into what that means in this context, which in this context, it means, set the economy class slot to true, right? So we still have an intermediate language that represents, here's what the user's trying to say, but it's a much richer language, and it incorporates the context of the business logic, and incorporates the context of the whole conversation. And it says, here's what the person is trying to achieve to progress the conversation, rather than this old school, I'm just doing a classification kind of approach.
So going back to the concept of intents then, you're still trying to, because and thanks for commenting on the recent post that I did, which was basically arguing that intents are not dead. And
right.
I think that there's James Jangola commented on it as well, I think, which was on a different post that alludes to it essentially, which is that the way that I explain intent is in when I use the language intent, really what I'm talking about is customer need. There's a need that the customer has, and they're expressing that in form of an intention that they want something to happen.
Yeah.
Whereas the other version of intent is that it's a machine learning classification system that is built on a natural language understanding system, and it requires training data, and it predicts the intent based on what's in its training data. And that's the label of intent that is given to the machine learning classification of something that someone says. So there's two meanings of intent. One is the technology that's used to map an utterance to a label. The other is the expression of a need from the customer. So Mark Post was getting at the concept of having to understand the needs of your customers and their intentions remains, but the technical methodology around defining and classifying this phrase into a bucket has changed. Would you concur with that?
That's beautifully put. That's very, 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 very well put. If I can take issue with one piece, it's not necessarily the case that the user expresses that need explicitly.
Yes.
The user has that need, and you might have to tease it out of them because they don't know that that's their need. They just know about their situation, and they shouldn't have to know what it is that you're going to do for them to remedy the situation, right?
Yeah, very true. And so CALM, if I understand this correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, CALM is a system that has the goal of understanding the underlying customer need, which is the second version of intention, not requiring the machine learning technologies that has been used traditionally in the first definition of intention.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. So the business process then, because I like the way that you're describing the difference between the two, and I think you're right. Most platforms deal with that stuff in a very messy fashion, which is that the conversation design and the conversation patterns is a representation of the business logic, including the messiness of conversation. Whereas the business process is different. So at the beginning of a project, when we define a business process and you map it out and you understand who's doing what and what systems are doing what and what APIs you have and all this kind of stuff, that's not the conversation. That's just the nuts and bolts of what's happening under the hood. How is that then represented in Rasa'a now? Because when you're saying that all you need to do is, guide the process, is that you describe it in natural language? Is it that you've got a kind of process mapping tool within there that the conversational elements can hook onto? Like, how does the business process definition bit work?
Yeah. Well, so it's a great question. So that's the part that you either define visually in the UI as a structured, flow, or you write it in code if you prefer to work there, right? And the kinds of things you put in there are, okay, the user told me that I messed up their order. They said my order's messed up. Okay, well, that is interesting, but we don't know what the problem is yet. So we gotta ask, like, what is the problem with your order, right? So you're asking the user for some information. So you're going to like a collect information type of approach, right? The information is like, well, is there something missing? Did it not come? Was it damaged? Did you not like the items? Right? Like there's some work you've got to do there. And then maybe you've got to call some internal APIs, right? Maybe they're telling you that something was missing. And maybe you go to call an API and say, hey, did we send this out in 2 separate batches? And maybe the second batch just hasn't come yet, right? So you've got some internal logic to think about as well. Mm-hmm. So it's really just saying, here's information I need from the user. Here's the information I need from my backend. And here's some sort of, decision points that are going to drive me in different directions, right? And then you're in there crafting, here's how I want to ask the user for that information. Here may be places where I hand them off to a human, or here's where I need to, plug in like a reusable piece of functionality, like an authentication or a follow-up survey to ask for feedback, all those kinds of things. So it's really just the core of, what is your specific process and logic for dealing with this request once you know what it is that the person wants, right?
Right.
But if you've got someone coming in and they say something really ambiguous, like they just give you a one-word thing, card, then you're not designing those sort of clarification flows. That's kind of one of the pieces that CALM takes care of for you. It says like, well, look, looking at the things that you've got, these are sort of the three most likely candidates. I'm going to go and ask the user a question like, hey, is it one of these things, right? And then do you want to like replace a card or cancel a card? And then the person comes in and gives you another one-word answer, right? They say cancel, right? Like, again, you look at the transcript, UI, we read it. They said card, then they said cancel. It's perfectly clear what they want to do. Stuff like that was really, really hard in an LLU-based world, right? You would have had to think, what's my classifier going to say about each of those words individually, and how I'm going to build this like conditional logic of like, if they're like, we don't have to do that anymore, right? We have these amazingly capable models, and they can do all of that stuff for us. And then when it comes to the actual like responses you send to the user, so when you're asking them for information, or you're telling them something, or you're calling out to an API, all those things, by default, you're just using a human-authored answer, and that's an obviously important piece, because we can say, we work a lot in like regulated industries. Rasa'a is very much like an enterprise platform, so people want to know for sure that it's going to go well. So the default is we use the templated answer that's written, by whoever's responsible for conversation design. That person might have the conversation designer title, they might not, but it's someone's crafted response. And then you can sort of adjust the dial depending on your comfort level. So you can say, okay, we're going to start with that, and then we're going to allow a little bit of rephrasing. Right, we're going to sprinkle some LLM magic fairy dust on top, right? And that it's a little less safe, but it's still pretty safe. And it does really make the experience a lot nicer, right? Classic example is, you deal with an out of scope request, right? Somebody's kicking the tires and says, can you order me a pizza? you get the stilted thing like, I am not programmed to support that request.
Yeah. Sorry,
Something like that, right?
Sorry, I didn't understand
Sorry,
that.
I didn't get that. Yeah, exactly. It's infinitely nicer as a user experience if you can say, you know what, I love pizza too. Unfortunately, I'm not a pizza chatbot. I can't help you with that, right? And it's the same answer, but it's been rephrased to be more contextual, more appropriate, and so you can start to sort of sprinkle that magic on top. And then if and where appropriate, you obviously you might be using a knowledge base and including some RAG answers. You might be doing some other use cases where you generate an answer for good reasons. And so you can introduce that as and when you're comfortable and kind of grow into it. But you can build something that's fully sort of LLM native and fully powering, fully tapping into the power of these models. And you can still put your hand on your heart and say, this thing won't hallucinate, right? So it's a nice way to build confidence in the system and then grow over time.
Nice. I gave a talk earlier today actually about to a company about general kind of trends in enterprise adoption of large language models, and one of the questions I was asked was like, where do you see it being used? Is it more sort of transformative, as in it's completely changing the way that things run and how things operate, or is it more iterative, as in it's being used to supplement existing technologies? And I kind of explained, like, in my opinion, my sort of ideal situation would be, you've got to think about what is the frailties of NLU systems. And the fundamental frailties really of NLU systems, which I think we've kind of alluded to, is that they just don't understand everything. It's as simple as that. I've never seen an NLU model that understands 100% of what people say to it, because the conversations are too varied. So the value of the large language models, or even small language models, is that they understand language far greater than you could ever assemble a bucket of training data for. So using it for understanding seems to be a natural place, and the companies that I've seen that are implementing it in kind of like public beta in large enterprises, they're using it as a supplement to the NLU. So they've still got the NLU in place. It's still doing 80% or 85% of the work. The 15% that it doesn't understand or can't classify, it's then giving it to the LLM to do the same and classify it that way. Or it's being used to do contextual responses. So in the example you gave there, the responses, if someone says, I want to book a holiday, and they're talking to an insurance company, the insurance company might respond with, I'm sorry, I can't book you the holiday, but I can get you some insurance if you want to be on it. So it's kind of like the fallback handling being contextual. Because the way it just dawned on me today that the response that you get back, conversation designers and developers working on these programs think about the two things as being two separate things. They think about understanding first, that's one problem, and then the next bit is figuring out what to do, and then the response that goes back, that's the second problem. But actually, the response that goes back is a symptom of how well you've understood. So if a large language model,
and it massively shapes what the person's going to say next.
Yeah, exactly, 100%.
If you ask a leading question, or you ask a yes or no question, or of course it massively impacts the UX.
Exactly. So if a language model is being used to do the understanding bit, and the business logic is deterministic, but the response is using the other benefit of a language model, which is the generation, and it's using it contextually to reflect the status of the conversation in the context, then those responses show that it's understood. So if you say, I want to book a holiday to an insurance company, and they say, I can't book you the holiday, but I can get you insurance for it, you're showing that you've understood what they've just said by repeating what they've just said back. So it's kind of like, for me, that's where language models in large enterprises have great benefit, is the understanding bit and the generation bit in terms of making the conversation feel more natural and like you've understood people. But the workflow bit is the bit where the risk is, where you don't really want to mess around with it and you want some determinism there. It sounds as though that's kind of what CALM does. It takes the messiness out of the dialogue management so it understands properly. You've still got the determinism on the workflow so that you've got no risk of anything going wrong where it actually matters. If you don't understand someone, then so what? If you mess up someone's card payments, you've got a problem. And then it can leverage the language models for what it's good for on the back end, which is contextual responses and making the conversation feel natural. Is that am I understanding that correctly here? Or?
Well, the piece I would take issue with is where you said that using the LLM for understanding and then still use the word classification, right?
Okay.
And using an LLM to do classification, it's like having a Ferrari and driving it on 30-mile-an-hour roads, right? It's the bottleneck. It's the original sin. I mean, so the way that we tackle this is we say, look, if you want to build confidence from migrating your existing NLU-based chatbot to CALM, what are your worst performing use cases? What are the ones that have the highest user frustration, the lowest success, right? 9 times out of 10, it's because there are issues there around the user expressing what they want, not in the way that you expect, and just a mismatch between the way the users talk about the problem and the way your intents are designed, or some like very subtle differences between different use cases. So to give us your hardest ones, let's migrate those to CALM. So we're going to get rid of this sort of classification approach for these use cases, and then you'll see the benefit, right? And then you say, wow, okay. One of the first times we did that, we had an overnight jump from like a 32% resolution rate to like a 52% resolution rate, right? So massive shift, because you've got a system that isn't relying on that classification approach and can understand the nuance, and can understand people correcting themselves and changing things. It's a far richer system. So I disagree with the idea that you're sticking kind of in the safe paradigm for understanding. You do need a new paradigm for understanding, and you do need to rethink what you think of as business logic. But aside from that, I would roughly agree with what you say. So the hill I will die on is I think it's a profoundly silly idea that you somehow have a better system if your LLM guessed the right set of steps versus just documenting and implementing the right set of steps to complete a task. It's information you already know. It's fascinating. Like, we've done some benchmarking, and you can find this on our blog and stuff like that. But I mean, it's not even a close comparison, right? How much faster and more efficient this is. And it also means you can really do it for voice, right? So we've got LLM native implementations in voice, where you've got to have that sub-second latency, right? And like, good luck programming like a fully agentic thing, with a powerful enough model to handle it and getting sort of real-time responses, right? No chance. So it's got all sorts of advantages to write that down. But it's just it was very in vogue for a while to say, no, actually it's somehow better if the LLM is agentic and like guesses the steps. But in the last month or so, I've seen a lot of big voices, and a growing chorus of voices in the opposite direction, sort of very much aligning with the way that we think about things with the CALM approach. Recent blog posts from Anthropic about building effective agents, also the Hugging Face blog post about their small agents library, things like that. There was this big blog post about like what we learned from a year of building with LLMs. And these are all sort of big voices in the industry, and they're all really coming to the same conclusion, which is, if you want something reliable, if you've got something moderately complex, use a deterministic workflow, and you'll have a much better time.
The thing I take issue with is that they still call them agents. Well, when they're not,
we all choose our battles. That could be yours.
Yeah, exactly. But going back to the I don't know whether the thing that we're discussing just then is a semantic thing, because when I was referring to classification, I'm not necessarily. It's the same thing as when I refer to intent. For me, I'm coming at it from a sort of design end user perspective. And when I say intent, I mean customer intention, customer need. When I say classification, I mean categorization of what this thing is.
Because my rigid thinking, but you're right.
Because there has to be something there which is, this means that, and that marries to this process that we have, or this answer to this question. That's kind of what I'm referring to as the classification bit. But I appreciate the explanation. I understand exactly what you're getting at, which is that it's not getting this thing and putting it into a bucket and then determining what happens next. It's dealing with the messiness of language to arrive at something that you can understand that marries to something that you can actually do.
How do you feel about calling that translation as opposed to classification?
I think that sounds good. The only problem is that you're going to get messy with language and stuff like that, isn't it? Because people are going to think that translation means going from German to English and all that kind of stuff. But I think that's basically.
I mean, in our case, that is how it works, right? We like translate into a machine language, but I see your point.
Yeah.
Potential for confusion there.
Yeah, I get it. And so, in the time we've got, there's two things I think we can cover quickly. One is what you alluded to towards the end there, which is the concept of agentic AI. And we started the conversation at the beginning with how I think that the definition isn't properly understood even by those companies that you just mentioned, because the articles that they're publishing, which is lessons learned in a year of building agents, they're talking about workflows, and workflows are deterministic, and by nature they're not temporally continuous, and they don't make their own decisions, and etc. So they don't conform to the actual definition of agent. However, regardless, there's been a lot of research into agents and multi-agent systems and stuff like that over the years, and the goal of those things is ultimately actually the predominant way that the research has been done on agents isn't just one agent that does something like book appointments. It's actually agents working together in unison to solve very complex problems. The way I've kind of been thinking about it over the last 6 months or so is that most businesses understand their processes, and you can probably describe them. They might be very complex. They might have lots of different variables and going on depending on lots of different stuff, but you can describe them. And the way I think about it is, if you can describe the process, then you don't need anything that's agentic and making it up as it goes along, because if you can describe it, then you can build it. And if you can build it, you can have robustness around it. Whereas if there is something of sufficient complexity where you just cannot describe it, it's too complex, there's too many variables, that for me seems to be the space where whatever this agentic AI concept is, seems to find its home. And I don't think that exists in businesses unless it's super long tail, super complex, kind of like tier 3, like intense stuff that requires the brain power of humans. That's kind of the area where I see it potentially being useful in the future. I don't know if you kind of concur with that thought process.
To an extent, I agree. I think something that people have been asking me that never used to ask me, and this is really about shifting goalposts. People now come to me and they say, yeah, but Alan, we've got 4,000 APIs across our enterprise, and I'm not going to build out workflows for each of them. Now, how are we going to do that? Because they have been promised by the hyperscalers that all you need to do is expose those 4,000 APIs to an LLM, and it will figure things out for you, right?
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Wisdom of that approach aside, that is the expectation that's being set, and people are asking those questions. And I think it is a valid question, because across the org now, the expectation is, well, we don't just want to tackle, the top use cases, the head of the distribution. We want to tackle the tail. We want to do everything. And okay, that's fair. And I think a great approach to that is to say, okay, well, when a long tail thing comes up, if you have the risk appetite for it, let an LLM improvise. Let it come up with something. And then if it does something that you like and it does it right, fantastic. Promote that into a structured workflow. And then every time it happens subsequently, you'll know that it continues to happen correctly, right? And so you're not having to do all this mind and work of programming things, but you can build a pipeline for increasing the breadth of what you're automating reliably. So I think the way I think about it, architecting a system that uses LLMs, think about what parts of this experience are genuinely going to change every time user interacts with it. That's where I want to use LLMs, because they have that breadth, that flexibility. For everything that's going to be the same each time, right, I'm much better off having that determined up front. So, the process for managing a refund, you're not going to make that up. It's not going to be different for every user. The way that users talk about it and their situation, that is going to change. The interpretation side, that's where you want to use the LLM. But unless the business logic is genuinely going to change for every single user, every single time you interact with it, you don't need to make it up on the fly. But from an organizational perspective, there is, I think there's this argument to say, well, okay, for long tail things that we haven't bothered to automate yet, we might accept the risk. It might get it right, it might get it wrong, but then at least, once it's done it right once, we can rely it from there on. Once we've promoted it to like a structured workflow.
That's very interesting. I've never come across it being explained in that way before, but that's a very interesting way of thinking about it, which is if there's a process that is sufficiently long tail that's not worth the effort to build from the beginning, using generative approach to define what the process is and let it figure out what the process should be and how it should do it, and then figure out how it did it, and then turn that into something more reliable is a very different approach.
Improvise once and then run it reliably forever.
I like that. I like that. Very last question, because I know we're on time. I definitely want to ask you this question. There was a lot of talk towards the back end of last year about conversation design and about the practice of conversation design and where that's going. I think that there's been some cognitive dissonance happening within the industry in terms of like large language models. Like, first of all, are they going to take everyone's jobs? Second of all, are they just an incremental gain? I think the reality is that, as we're seeing in CALM and as we're seeing in other solutions with retrieval augmented generation and stuff like that, the art and science of crafting the dialogue management bit, which was a large part of the job, no longer required and going to be less and less required. The art and science of the model building and training and stuff like that, less and less required. You've got general purpose models that can understand pretty much everything. So the role in terms of what the traditional role of conversation designers do has and is changing and will change. So the question that was asked at the back end of last year, and I think it's a good question to ask you, is the role of conversation design dead or not?
If I were a conversation designer today, I would be delighted. And I'm biased, but especially if I got to work with a system like CALM, because the tedium and the misery of mapping out what if the user says this, what if the user says that, every possible interaction, every possible path of this tree, awful. And I'm so glad we don't have to do it anymore. But we can still craft, okay, well, what is actually a good experience, and what is the business process, and how do we craft this question? And I love those talks from sort of leading conversation designers, where they show just how different the UX can be just by tweaking the copy a little bit. And of course, the broader design question of, well, it's not just the conversation. The conversation lives inside of some web app or mobile app or on the phone, or it's part of some larger ecosystem. And thinking of it really as experience design, and what's the person's context and what context do they bring into the conversation. So absolutely not going away. And I think now more focused on the things that are actually design and less pseudo implementation.
The stuff that takes all of your time and drains all of your energy, meticulously crafting the same line of dialogue in a different way. I totally agree, and I think that the promise of interaction, human-computer interaction with human-computer interaction in general, the promise of conversational interfaces is that really you should be using the correct modality for the right use case, and every single turn in a conversation should utilize the right elements for that turn. So if you want to get a date from somebody, it might not be the best way to constantly go back and forth on the date. Use a date picker, yeah. So it's stuff like this. But that stuff is stuff that was just so far away from designers building chatbots, because they had to spend all of their time and energy on building and training the model, crafting the dialogue paths in the dialogue management, crafting the responses and all that kind of stuff. So it seems to me, I agree that I think the role will change, and I think, I'll call it conversational service design, which is that you're more of a service designer because you're thinking about not the conversational dialogue bit, but about the business process and how you're going to deliver value, process design and process engineering and stuff like that, as well as I think content's a big part of it in the RAG sort of the implementation. But at least you can think about the experience holistically, the whole customer journey, rather than just let's make this bot work.
Yeah.
Nice.
Amen.
Alan, absolute pleasure as always. Thank you so
Thanks
much
for having me on, Ken.
for your time.
Good catching up.
Yeah, likewise, and thank you for all of your support with Unparsed and everything we do. It's really appreciated, and hopefully we'll see you back this year. And we'll do this again sometime. Let's not leave it 2 years next time.
I'm sure we won't. Okay.
Nice one. Cheers. Appreciate it, Alan. Thanks now. See you soon.